Hey there, pumpkin pies. I know that a lot of you that watch my channel are actively engaging in shadow work to one degree or another. I know that lots of you that watch my channel are interested in shadow work, interested in really diving into the darker side of the psyche, diving into your difficult experiences, your flaws, the negative habits you keep getting yourself involved in, the things that you're not proud of, you know, that kind of thing, the mistakes that you've made, the mistakes that you keep consistently making, the stuff that you keep trying to push down, the stuff that you have been trying to avoid for months or even years. I know that a lot of people that follow my stuff are into the idea of getting those things out on the table, being honest about them, delving into them. So what I want to get into with this particular video is looking at the areas of shadow that come along with the process of shadow work. I'm going to basically talk through a few things that happen during the process of shadow work that can be really negative, really damaging, really unhelpful, and that we do need to make sure that we look out for. There are various different pitfalls, various different traps, various different sticky situations that shadow workers get themselves into once they've made that decision, that commitment to themselves, that they're going to delve into the dark underbelly of the psyche. There are definitely some wrong turns that can be taken, and there are definitely some common things that happen for shadow workers that need to be recognized as shadowy aspects of shadow work itself. I really hope that's making sense. I'm going to dive into the list now, and I think it will probably make more sense to anybody who's confused by it as I'm actually going through it. Now, if you are a shadow worker, if you are actively engaging in shadow work right now, or you have done in the past, I really want to urge you to listen to these items on the list and think about whether or not you are exhibiting any of these behaviors. Think about whether or not any of these things are currently a problem for you. And if you do find that anything on the list makes sense and sounds familiar, and you're like, yeah, definitely I'm exhibiting that trait, then it's the perfect time for you to become conscious of it, sit with it, try and recognize where it's coming from, and recognize that there are better ways of doing shadow work. And if you do recognize that there are quite a lot of things on this list that are coming up for you, it might be a good time to just put the brakes on with your shadow work and think about how you can get yourself into a place to do a healthier form of shadow work. Because I do think if we're exhibiting like half or more of the things on this list, then our shadow work is not particularly healthy, and it might actually be causing more harm than good. Here's my list of 10 things that I recommend that you look out for as a shadow worker, and these are things that are problematic, damaging, unhelpful, and that you might want to make sure that you check in with to ensure that you are not bringing this kind of thing into your shadow work journey. This list is not exhaustive. There are definitely going to be other things that you can look out for. There are definitely going to be other issues or blind spots that come up for people that are doing diligent shadow work. These are just 10 that I've definitely come across before with myself, with my clients when I've been chatting to clients, with my audience members as I've been talking to them over time. So number one is using your findings in shadow work as a justification for continued bad behavior. Some shadow workers do end up in this particular trap where they are using the fact that their parents raised them in specific negative or unhelpful ways as an excuse to keep behaving in negative and unhelpful ways in the present. The whole idea of shadow working a difficult experience or a series of difficult experiences or negative parenting that you received is so that you can look at the source of the issues that you're facing and then recognize that you actually have the final say over how you respond to these things that happened in the past. Awareness is the key to being able to choose a number of different avenues instead of being trapped into going just down one avenue. So if something happened to you in the past and that occurrence was the seed of a very negative pattern of behavior, when you recognize that seed, when you actually take it in your hand and you look at it and you acknowledge, yeah, that was the source, and I actually recognize how it's gone on to mean so many other negative things for me, really that should be the start of something wonderful. It's the start of your consciousness around that particular issue. It's the start of your acknowledgement of where it came from and why you behave that way. But the idea is that we then integrate that information into our sense of who we are and into our sense of what the available responses are to the things that happen to us in life. For example, in my shadow work, I recognized a lot of the reasons why I ended up being a really angry little bitch face in my adolescence, and why I caused a lot of pain, and why I had a very violent energy inside of me. I recognized the reasons for that, and I sat with those reasons. But I also recognized that I cannot use those reasons and that treatment that I received and that familial junk that I inherited as an excuse to keep being an angry little bitch face until my dying day. That's not what I want to do. That's not what shadow work is for. It's not so that we can sit within the justification for the behavior that we have no intention of changing. So point number one, are you using what you're finding in shadow work as a justification for continued bad behavior? Are you actually intending fully to continue on with that bad behavior? Are you too proud to change? Do you just believe it's not possible for you to change? And so in that case, your shadow work findings are then creating the perfect excuse for you to continue with the way that you are and with the destructive behaviors that you're exhibiting. It's really so important to be honest with ourselves about this. I always say that shadow work is not about changing yourself, but if you do shadow work, you will change. And that's really as simply as I can put it across to you. And some people will find that really like head fucky, and other people will be like, yeah, that makes total sense. Simple, easy, to the point, and I get it. Point number 2 that we need to look out for: are we using our findings in shadow work as a way to punish ourselves, berate ourselves, bully ourselves, mock ourselves? Lots of people have a very, very strong inner critic, a very strong voice of an inner bully. And the findings in shadow work can often become material for that really nasty voice to come in and start mocking and berating and bullying, essentially. If you go into shadow work with a complete deficit of self-love, a complete deficit of self-esteem, not even a baseline level of self-respect, then you really are in danger of digging up things from your shadow and using them to taunt yourself and be mean to yourself. Ask yourself if that's what you're doing. Ask yourself if you spend the majority of your time in your shadow work sessions, and maybe even afterwards, being down on yourself about crappy decisions you made, things that you feel you did wrong, characteristics that you have that you despise in yourself. Because if you're digging up stuff in the shadow and you're finding more and more content, that content very quickly then becomes weaponized, and it's something that your inner bully, your inner critic, uses to further harm you. So really important to ask yourself if that is what is happening. Number 3 on my list for shadow workers is superiority and judgment. This is a big deal for shadow workers. It's definitely a pitfall that we can find ourselves going into. When you are giving a lot of your effort and your focus and your energy to digging up those things in the psyche that are tough to look at, and you're really doing that good work, you've got to make sure that you don't move into a superiority complex where you see yourself as being actually more connected, more in touch, stronger or braver than people who are not actively doing that work. So if you find yourself slipping into a superiority complex in your thoughts and feelings about those around you, definitely check yourself with that, because it can be really unhelpful, and we can end up being really unkind to people around us who actually are just on a different part of the journey to us. Along with this superiority or this judgment of people who are not on the path and doing the work of the heart warrior, if you will, is a pushiness. And there can be shadow workers that can be very pushy. Now, I think with anything that we discover in life that is really helpful to us and feels really good for us, there can definitely be a temptation to want to push that amazing thing onto people around us, and we've got to be really careful that we don't do that. For instance, if you discover that a particular exercise is amazing to you, or a particular dietary change is amazing to you, or you've moved to a different location and it's just been the most amazing thing ever, and it's been everything you ever dreamed of, and it's changed you so positively, obviously the temptation will be there to start to try and convince others that they really need to get onto this good shit and they really need to be doing the damn thing. And that can be incredibly off-putting and oppressive and alienating for people around us who want to continue a relationship with us but really don't want to feel pushed or preached to. So that's something to keep in mind. The pushiness, the shoviness, the judgment, the superiority. Think about how you're treating other people as you move into your deep shadow work. There's nothing wrong with being proud of yourself for doing this hard work. It's amazing, and it's one of the most incredible journeys in self-development, I think. And you do have to be brave to do it, and it is hard. But that doesn't mean that people who are not on that path are somehow lesser than we are. And sometimes, even if we don't consciously think that, which I don't think a lot of us consciously do, we end up subtly implying it through the way that we interact with people as shadow workers. The 4th issue that I recommend that you look out for as a shadow worker is the pursuit of perfection. The idea as you begin shadow work that you're going to end up being ascended, being perfect, having no issues anymore, and never being in the wrong anymore. That's something that I recommend you scrub out as early as possible on your journey. It's not going to happen like that. And as I often say to people as well, your shadow work is never really done, because unless you're going to sit on high on your throne, superior, and shadow worked into some you know, godlike figure, and you're never going to have any other experiences or any other relationships, you are going to be living your life. You're going to be going through things. And as you go through things, new content will be added to the shadow. You will meet people who do things or say things to you that will trigger things in you that will then go into your shadow. You will have experiences that you never had before on the journey of life, and that will create new shadow content. You will move into a new energetic or spiritual phase of life, and new stuff is going to be in the shadow that wasn't in there before when you did your previous work. So that's why we return to shadow work periodically over the course of our lifespan. So if you are in any way convinced or hopeful that your shadow work is in the pursuit of perfection or complete ascendance above human, definitely scrap that from your brain box, because that's not going to happen, and that definitely shouldn't be the aim. Number 5 on the list of things that shadow workers can be looking out for is wallowing. Wallowing, or as I like to think of it in my own work, not surfacing, not resurfacing, avoiding the resurface. So that means I've gone down there into the shadowscape, I've found something, and instead of bringing it up to actually examine it and do the work with it and really make that effort to further understand it and integrate it, I start shrouding myself in it, I start wallowing, you know, I get extremely emotional for long periods of time. I curl up with it instead of using it to further my own sense of self-understanding and self-development. I think it's very easy for me to understand the difference between when I'm wallowing or kind of shrouding myself in it and when I'm actually using it for the good of my development. Maybe it will be more or less difficult for you to understand when that's happening in your journey, but I would definitely recommend that from now onwards you actually observe when it might be happening. Obviously, when we touch upon something in shadow work, sometimes it can be overwhelming, sometimes it can be a very high intensity experience, it can have a very big impact, and there's no doubt that sometimes we will cry over it, we will feel our feelings, we'll need to sit with the memory or sit with the realization. There's no doubt about that. But I think we all need to have this kind of mature understanding of when that has developed into an unhelpful wallowing, where we are feeling very sorry for ourselves or shrouding ourselves in the memory for days and days. We're reliving it, and it's actually atrophying our sense of development. It's actually unhelpful for us, and it feels unhealthy in some way. If you can be honest with yourself about where you are wallowing in your shadow work, that is a really awesome skill for you to have as a shadow worker, because when we are wallowing and we are in complete non-movement and we've shrouded ourselves in our pain and we're curling up with it for weeks on end, that's not shadow work anymore. That's something quite different. So it's really important that you recognize the difference between effectively using your findings and just curling up with your findings and ending up in non-movement. Number 6, I'm now on to the second hand. So number 6 on the list of things that shadow workers can be looking out for that might be causing a difficulty is avoiding practical application. My feeling is very much that we can look at our findings in shadow work but actually not be practically applying them to our lives. I like to think that after I've found something in my shadow and I have developed an understanding of it and why it's there, I then want to practically apply it through a series of experimentations. I want to put myself in the path of the shadow trigger so I can understand how I can rework my response to that shadow content. I'm trying to think of an example that I can give that's not necessarily strictly from my journey but might kind of help you to understand. Okay, so let's say that I've discovered something in my shadow that is about how I feel around big groups of people. So group dynamics, big parties, big conversations, big public debates, big bunches of friends together. Let's say that I've realized that I've got a lot of insecurity about that, stemming from various different things that I can identify in my background. And let's say that I've recognized that I always behave in this certain very egregious way when I'm around these big bunches of people. The experimentation phase in shadow work is to place myself there in the path of the train, as it were. It's really to actually give myself the opportunity to meet with my trigger and have a different kind of experience where my understanding of my shadow reaction can lead me to make different decisions about how I actually perform in the pressure of that big bustling group dynamic. We can experience shadow findings about the way that we are in our creative life, the way that we are in our spiritual life, the way that we feel about a specific family member, the way that we feel about a specific location, all that kind of thing. But if we are not practically applying that by placing ourselves in the path of the shadow trigger and giving ourselves the opportunity to apply our knowledge and have a different kind of experience, then are we really using the findings at all? Is there really anything happening? Can we really know that anything is changing or that we are integrating anything? everything. I think that a big way that this happens with a lot of people is with boundaries. If we are shadow working our boundaries, particularly with regard to a specific individual, then it's really important that we give ourselves an opportunity to utilize our shadow findings in order to draw our boundaries differently. Practical application when it comes to boundaries is spending time around, let's say, that specific person that you know that you have poor boundaries with, and actually making your boundaries stronger, knowing deep down inside you that the reason that you have these difficult issues with boundaries around that specific person is because of these things that you have found in your shadow work. You have an understanding of those things, and so through the understanding you have control over your responses to that person or that situation. That's the idea. So the idea is that slowly you go through a series of practice runs where you actually do things differently because of the knowledge that you have about what's going on in shadow. I have actually managed to maintain relationships with a few people in my life around whom I had a lot of shadow, and there was a lot of shadow in our relationship, and I've actually managed to maintain those relationships by examining what is going on with me, what needs to be different for me, what do I need to be brave enough to change in this situation, and what is it within the shadow that makes me feel like I can't change it. And then I moved into the practical application phase, and maybe that might have been communicating with that person what I needed the boundaries to be, or maybe it was about subtly, implicitly shifting my boundaries and allowing that person to kind of cotton on and follow suit with what I was doing. I think it's way too easy for me to just take my shadow findings and kind of like move them off the board and say, thanks very much, I'm done now, I'm cashing in, I'm not playing anymore, and that's it. But I think the practical application where you keep playing the game of life, knowing what you know and using that knowledge to improve your experiences, that's where the rubber meets the road with shadow work. I really hope that's making sense. If you know that you are sort of sitting in a bit of a gilded cage with all of your shadow information and your shadow findings, but you know that you're not really putting yourself in the midst of the cyclone, you're not putting yourself in the path of that shadow stuff, then I would recommend taking a risk, doing what you need to do in some way to put yourself in a situation where normally your shadow does come out and it does take over. But actually, armed with the knowledge from your shadow explorations, you can move into that situation anew, and you can be like, okay, I know now why I'm going to want to react the way I'm going to want to react, and I know what is going to trigger me to want to behave the way I normally behave, and with all of that knowledge at my disposal, I can give myself a different experience now. I do not have to allow my shadow to take over and give me an experience that I later in hindsight think to myself, shit, that had nothing to do with me, I didn't want to behave that way. Number 7 on the list is expecting quick results or easy results. We can become very disheartened very early on in shadow work when we expect things to go from head to heart very, very quickly. So shadow work involves quite a lot of the time reaching an intellectual understanding of why something is going on in your life that is shadowy. So you can look at the evidence for why something is going on, and you can be like, okay, I have an understanding now of why this is shadowy for me. But what a lot of people do is they expect that intellectual understanding to immediately produce a feeling in the heart space of something being different, and the ability to move beyond that shadow, to integrate it and to not allow it to take control anymore. And actually, normally what happens is we get the intellectual understanding first, but then we have to go through a lot of different experiences of toughening up with our understanding of shadow findings before we really see lasting positive change. Just because we realise why we're making a mistake over and over again doesn't mean that that realisation is going to stop the mistake from ever happening. We're going to continue to take the wrong road or do the wrong thing, but with that knowledge we can correct ourselves quicker and quicker and quicker each time. We can be like, oh, I remember, yeah, that's a shadow thing, hang on, take that, reverse it, you know. So we need to make sure that we are not expecting way too much from shadow work, where we are really wanting the quickest results, we're wanting the easiest results, we're not willing to put the work in time after time. And I'm going to use that analogy that I use so often on this channel, and it's the analogy about defying the sat-nav. If you have a piece of deep conditioning that keeps telling you, like a satellite navigation device, that this is the way you go, this is the way you drive, this is the way you're supposed to be going, then it's quite hard to defy that sat-nav, because the sat-nav keeps speaking to you. The neural pathway keeps saying, we do this, we've always done this is what we want to do. So when you turn and start going in the other direction, based on the knowledge that you have all of these other choices now, the sat-nav is still talking, the sat-nav is still piping up. So it is hard, and you are sometimes going to follow the sat-nav, even though you've decided to defy it. So if you know that there are some very sort of set neural pathways that take you in a shadowy direction with something, don't expect that just because you've realized that it means you're never going to take that shadowy path again. That's actually not true, and we can become disillusioned when we convince ourselves that that is the case. Sometimes something will click for you sort of intellectually, and you'll go, well, yeah, that makes sense, but actually you're going to find that you still make those mistakes, you still exhibit those behaviors. It's okay. It doesn't mean that you failed, it just means that these things take time to truly be integrated. We are now at number 8 on the list of things that I would recommend that shadow workers look out for when they're doing their shadow work, and this is conditional growth. I often say that the shadow is like a big old web, and if you want to put your hand in and take one thread, one piece of thread on that web and pull it out and say, I'm just going to work on this thing, what's going to happen? The whole web is going to come as well, because the shadow is a series of connections and a series of associations, and you will notice that there are certain clusters of things in your shadow that are linked to other things that you really wouldn't expect. You wouldn't believe the amount of times when I've been talking to clients, and the amount of times on my own journey with shadow as well, that I have been working on a specific thread in shadow, and I've been like, well, I've just realized that that is connected all the way back to there, and I did not realize that before. Wow. And that is just one of those things. So we cannot just start shadow work and say to ourselves, I only want to focus on the career stuff and the money stuff, but I don't want to look at my marriage, I don't want to look at my parenting, I don't want to look at my past, I only want to look at these things. If you think you can play it safe like that, and you think you can isolate something inside a vacuum and work on that and that alone, I have to tell you now that you're already in the danger zone when it comes to being a shadow worker, because things are connected by virtue of the way that our psyche works. Things are connected to each other. Sometimes I think this is about respecting shadow work, and this is something I've talked about on the channel before as well, and I think it's really important. I think that we need to respect the power of shadow work, and a lot of people would see this as fear-mongering, and I've heard it described as fear-mongering before. It's not fear-mongering to insist that somebody respects the power of shadow work in terms of how potently it can change your life journey. And I think that's something that does need to be a bit of a disclaimer before people actually start looking at the dark underside, the things they've been trying to suppress, the difficult things that they normally try to avoid or push down, right? So I'm not saying that nobody ever fearmongers when it comes to shadow work. I've seen some fearmongering. I've seen some people saying, don't do shadow work, it's going to turn your whole life to shit. It's not a good thing. Don't trust the people selling the shadow work snake oil. You know, I've seen that kind of rhetoric, right? For sure. But I think that people like me, for instance, who just try to clarify how powerful it can be and how much it can change you, I don't think we're fearmongers. I think we are showing respect for the work and how powerful it can be. And I think we're wanting to let people know that there is that power to it, that it does pack a punch. So if you're going into shadow work only wanting to look at a specific cluster of things, but you feel like other things are completely out of bounds, your shadow work is probably not going to be that effective, because you're already shutting yourself down to the possibility of revelation, of actually discovering that something is connected to something else, or that these things do come together in a bit of a package deal. Please ignore the dogs. I really just don't know why people let their dogs bark for ages in the back garden. It makes no sense to me. So yeah, so you're shutting yourself down essentially from the idea of revelation, from learning things that you didn't know before. So you can't afford to have that much of a tight handle on your shadow work exploration. Conditional growth, I think, is really the killer when it comes to doing really effective shadow work. You've got to be prepared to know that everything is on the table, and that you might come across something that you weren't expecting. And in fact, that's what you want in shadow. That's what we hope for in shadow work. Now, certainly certainly you can decide that there's going to be a bout of shadow work that you're going to do where it's going to be about your job, or it's going to be about your spirituality, or it's going to be about your relationship with your mum. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with categorizing the things about shadow work that need to be addressed for you, and deciding that you are going to address one thing per session or one thing per period of shadow work. But you've just got to be aware of the fact that things can be threaded to other things that you didn't expect. And so if you've got certain things in your shadow work which are off limits and which you are insisting that you're not going to be looking at, that's a problem, and that's very unrealistic. The ninth thing that I would recommend that you look for as a shadow worker, a pitfall that you make sure that you don't find yourself stumbling into, is only doing shadow work to appease other people. Only doing shadow work because you feel like you're going to lose a relationship, or you're going to disappoint somebody in your life if you don't do it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that being one of your motivators, but I think it's very harmful for it to be the only motivator. Anyone could leave your life at any time, whether they leave your life because they meet somebody else and they want to move on from you, whether they go through some kind of big change and they need to go off and soul search, whether the Grim Reaper decides it's their time. We lose people all the time for all kinds of reasons. Please don't let anybody be the only motivating factor for you in your shadow work. Please love yourself enough to know that it is for you as well, and that you are worthy of doing this work for you, not just because you want to be a better parent, not just because you want to be a better husband, not just because, you know, you want to be a better teacher, you want to be a better sibling, you want to be a better member of the community. All of those motivations are so valid and so beautiful and so right on, and I love that. But that's got to be part of a bigger motivation that must include self. And I really hope that if it can't include love for yourself in the beginning, then at a certain point on the journey it does include love for yourself. I know that a lot of people have given up addictive habits for someone in their life, because someone in their life was feeling really hurt by it, or someone in their life wanted to see that person do better and have better. But then that relationship has broken down, or that person has moved on, and the person who thought their addiction goes right back to it. So we can't really know that we're set on a good journey in the long term and for the rest of our lives if we're only on that good journey to appease somebody, to impress somebody, to make sure we don't lose somebody, as an ultimatum that somebody else has given us. We have to know that we're doing it for ourselves as well. And this is something I feel really passionately about on my own journey, because I came to know the difference for myself along the way between loving myself and giving myself more because somebody else loved me and wanted me to have more, and then loving myself and giving myself more because I felt I was worthy of it and I knew I was worth it. Number 10, we're all the way to the end of the list now. The 10th pitfall that shadow workers can fall into, that I wanted to mention, that I wanted to kind of get across to you, is projecting. So basically, when you discover something in your shadow and it makes sense to you and it explains a lot of things for you and it answers a lot of questions for you, you are then in danger of projecting that onto somebody else. If somebody in your life seems to have a similar kind of problem to you, they seem to have similar kinds of habits, they might have a similar relationship with their mom, they're going through some issues basically that you feel you can relate to. Do not be tempted to take your knowledge of your shadow findings and plaster it onto their journey. Whether you're being pushy about it, whether you're, really kind of being demanding with them about it, or whether you're just allowing it to affect the way you internally think about them. Projection, when it comes to shadow work stuff, it's not useful, it's not going to be helpful. Everybody's on their own individual journey, and even though there is sometimes some overlap between people's experiences and there are undoubtedly similarities in people's life stories, we've got to be careful that we're not taking our shadow work paintbrush and painting over everybody else's individual issues with it and convincing them, or just convincing ourselves that we know what's up and we know what's happening with that person. Just because we have done some shadow work learning and had some realizations doesn't mean that we can apply that knowledge of self to other people who seem to be having a similar issue or going through a similar thing. We have to let people have their own experiences. We have to let people come to realizations in their own time. We have to accept that there's a bunch of stuff about a person that we don't know. We have to accept that everybody is wired slightly differently. And although, as I mentioned, there is overlap, sometimes when we come to such deep, profound findings in our shadow work, it can convince us that we now know what's going on with others, and we know what other people need, and we understand the steps other people should take. It can convince us that we've figured out the way somebody ticks, or the way somebody works, or why somebody's doing something, or what their agenda is, based on our realizations about ourselves. And we can't afford to be too rigid in our readings and judgments of others based on what we've learned about ourselves. So if you recognize that you're doing that, then I would definitely recommend putting the brakes on, having a look at that, having a look at the destructive way that that could be affecting your relationships with others. I very much hope that this list has been useful for shadow workers out there. I very much enjoyed putting this together and talking through it. I would love to know what your opinions are in the comments about anything on the list. Is there anything on your particular list of shadow work pitfalls that you want to mention that I didn't put across in my list? Have you noticed that anything on this list has affected you? And is there any helpful way that you can put across to others of dealing with that particular pitfall if you've been through it and you've come out the other side of it? Guys, don't forget that you can join my newsletter. I do put out occasional exclusive video content to my newsletter subscribers only. Sometimes it's musings and ramblings with a cup of tea. Sometimes it is a deck unboxing. Sometimes it's a reading with cards. So if you want more video content from me, please go down below and click over to become a subscriber to my newsletter. I'm going to be sending something out fairly soon, and I send things out semi-regularly. There's no rhyme and reason. It's just whenever I feel like checking in with my newsletter peeps. You can also go down there and see my social media links, and don't forget that I will be putting the playlist down below of all my shadow work content that I've done so far. So if you're new around here and you've found this video to be perplexing and overwhelming, then I can assure you, you have started in the wrong place, and there are much more suitable shadow work videos that I've made to help you understand more about what it is and how you can get into it. So much love until next time, shadow workers. Mwah, blessed be.